I am Dane Oppenborn. I am an OLLI student assistant here, and we're going to start our brown bag presentation meeting. We ask that during the meeting that you please keep your mic muted. The presenters today will take questions and comments at the end of the presentation. And if you do wanted to raise a concern or question, you can raise your hand, or you can type in a question in the chat so that we can refer to it later. Oh, hold on a sec here. Thank you for recording. Next slide. Here at OLLI, we believe that learning should never end. And we really, really enjoy having these meetings in all the classes. And we thank you for joining us today. And for a land acknowledgement, we acknowledge Cal Poly. Oh. Sorry, I'm getting pop-ups on my screen. We acknowledge that Cal Poly Humboldt is on the land of the Wiyot peoples, which includes the Wiyot tribe, the Bear River Rancheria, and the Blue Lake Rancheria. Arcata is known as Gudini, over the woods, or among the redwoods. Wiyot peoples continue to remain in relationship to these lands through ceremony, culture, and stewardship. Just a reminder that we have started our fall OLLI semester. We have tons and tons of both in-person and online classes available and ready to sign up for. And if you wanted to look at the full list of our classes, head on over to our OLLI website, and you can see all the information, the instructors, the locations, the fees. And we do ask that you register early because they fill up pretty quick. And a good thing about being an OLLI member is that you get benefits like library access, and the same, if you're enrolled as an OLLI student, you have the same OLLI or student access that Cal Poly Humboldt students, and you get the two. And then we have library cards and library IDs, student IDs available, and a process on how you get that going. So thank you. Oh, Karen. And then another perk being an OLLI member this upcoming weekend is the Redwood Coast Music Festival. It's going to be from September 29th to October 2nd. And as an OLLI member, you get a little discount. So all the event tickets are $95. The primetime ticket is $35. And I believe that the normal pricing of the tickets for non-OLLI members is around $120 or $150, something like that. So there's a lot of really cool perks for being an OLLI member. And yeah, just hope that you are aware of this music festival coming up.
Actually, the price of the OLLI event ticket is $160 now. So it's
$160.
Yep.
Wow.
Prime
Okay.
time is 60. So it's a really big savings.
Huge savings. Thank you, Lynn.
You're welcome.
All righty. And we want to thank the Friends of OLLI. Our program would not be possible without your help and support. So thank you, everybody. And without further ado, we are now going to begin our OLLI Brown Bag presentation for the Alzheimer's Association International Conference highlights. And this is with our presenters Claire Day and Kim Coelho. I'm going to turn it over to Jane to introduce them.
And I'm delighted to welcome everyone today to this presentation by Claire Day and Kim Coelho. Claire Day is Chief Program Officer for the Alzheimer's Association Northern California and Northern Nevada chapter. She is a clinical social worker and received her degree from Bloomsburg University in 1993. Prior to joining the Alzheimer's Association, she worked in the long-term care field as a patient and family advocate. Kim, on the other hand, has a BA in journalism from HSU and an MS in community health from Austin Peay State University. She worked for the American Cancer Society for 15 years as a health educator and fundraiser. She now works for the Alzheimer's Association as a community engagement manager. Welcome to you both. I think the majority of this presentation is with Claire, and then Kim will bring up the end with some information on what's happening with the Alzheimer's Walk. So go for it, Claire. We're happy to have you here. Thank you so much.
Great. Jane, thank you so much. And thanks everybody for inviting the association here today to give you a little update on where we are with Alzheimer's and dementia research. And my mouse is not cooperating. Can someone just confirm that the right part of my slides are showing?
They are.
Great, perfect. Thank you. So as Jane said, today we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the latest in science. Some of this you might have heard about. Some is new, hot off the presses from our conference that was held just 2 months ago in San Diego. This is the largest Alzheimer's and dementia research conference in the world, and really is at the heart of our mission and vision at the Alzheimer's Association. And we are leading the way to not just end Alzheimer's and all other dementia through global research, driving risk reduction and early detection, but really focused on supporting people and those who are living with the disease, their care partners, and anyone who's interested. So I love that you're taking advantage of one of our programs today to learn a little bit about the latest in Alzheimer's and dementia science, some highlights specifically around early detection and diagnosis. And we were talking about this a little bit before we got started about how we really need to normalize dementia and how there's such a stigma still in regards to Alzheimer's and dementia. And it's something that we at the association is really trying to work towards eliminating because it is a biological change to our brains that causes Alzheimer's or dementia. And so really excited to be able to share some of that with you and some of the latest in clinical trials and treatments, as well as things that we can all be doing to decrease our risk of developing dementia. I always like to start with a little bit of level setting because we hear the words Alzheimer's and dementia, and sometimes people think that they're interchangeable, and they are different. And so this may be a repeat to a lot of you, but I think it's just really valuable to kind of start our presentation really level setting on that difference. So dementia is a syndrome. It's what we call an umbrella term used to really describe the range of symptoms associated with cognitive impairment. So if you could picture that umbrella to say the word flowers, underneath the umbrella would be things like tulips or daffodils or petunias or carnations, all different types of flowers. And underneath our umbrella of dementia, you'll see different biological changes that are impacting cognition on the brain, behavioral and psychological symptoms, and they are causing this cognitive decline. And so really dementia is that broad term that's really describes the symptoms as opposed to what's happening in the brain to cause the symptoms. So some of the studies you'll hear me referring specifically to Alzheimer's, and that's because they may impact or be working towards a biological change of Alzheimer's. So in most cases, that's working on either the amyloid protein or the tau protein. Whereas when you hear me referring to some studies using the word dementia, maybe it's a broader and maybe it was multiple types of dementia that were enrolled in a study. I think what's really important to note is, of course, Alzheimer's is the most common cause of dementia, which is why we hear a little bit more about it and a little bit more is known about it at this time. Other popular or not popular, but more common types of dementia that you may have heard of, vascular dementia, that's that dementia related to having a stroke. So when you hear me talking about good cardiovascular health, that's where vascular dementia might play a role. Dementia related to Lewy bodies, frontotemporal dementia, different types of changes in the brain that are causing this loss of function of enough severity that it's impacting our activities of daily living. And in most of these cases, we're talking about causes of cognitive decline that are not reversible. There are some causes of cognitive decline that are reversible, but what we're talking about here, these are progressive over time. And once the progression has started, you can't go backwards. Now, I mentioned as we started the need to really destigmatize Alzheimer's, and these facts and figures are really helping to illustrate why we need to do that. So today, more than 6 million Americans are living with Alzheimer's. 1 in 3 seniors dies with Alzheimer's or another dementia. And you notice that says with, not because of, and that's an important distinction, right? That people can die of other things while they have dementia. And I think the cost of care is just what's really the most staggering to me. Caregivers are actually providing what we call unpaid care. And those 11 million caregivers that are providing care to their loved ones, it would equate to the value of nearly $272 billion. That's all being done by caregivers. And that's on top of that number that you see on the right-hand side, which is the actual cost of the nation through Medicare and Medicaid, which is about $321 billion in 2022 alone. So this is a disease that impacts more people than not. We know that if you have a brain, you are at risk for developing Alzheimer's or dementia. And what we're really trying to figure out is why that is and what we can do to prevent that. We've talked a lot over years about really trying to understand Alzheimer's disease as a continuum of cognitive decline. And what we mean by that is everyone will start off what we call asymptomatic, meaning that they have no cognitive symptoms, but possibly some of the biological changes are beginning to happen in the brain. Mild cognitive impairment due to Alzheimer's disease means that someone is living with the early stages of that cognitive loss, but it's not necessarily impacting their activities of daily living, but those changes would be noticeable. So if someone were to get an assessment, they might show up as having mild cognitive impairment, but their day-to-day life isn't impacted. Someone who may go on to develop dementia due to Alzheimer's disease then is passing through an additional phase, which means they may experience mild, moderate, or severe stages of dementia. Now, what's really important and why I like to show this slide is that we all start off here. Some people will develop mild cognitive impairment. And some of those people will go on to develop the more severe stages of dementia. But not everybody who develops mild cognitive impairment goes on to develop Alzheimer's disease or dementia. But everybody that develops dementia, these mild, moderate, or severe symptoms, will pass through mild cognitive impairment. And why that's important is that if we can prevent new cases of mild cognitive impairment, we can prevent new cases of dementia. And while this is a huge risk factor, right? If you have mild cognitive impairment, you are, certainly at risk of developing dementia. It's not inevitable. And so it's really important to understand that when you hear some of the science that's actually trying to address this. Now, we also, because Alzheimer's disease is the most common type of dementia, I like to spend a little bit of time on this slide, really just helping to illustrate these biological changes that I was referring to earlier. So Alzheimer's disease is defined by 3 hallmark changes in the brain: the presence of beta amyloid plaques, tau tangles, and neurodegeneration or nerve cell death in the areas of the brain that are really important for things like cognition, memory, and behavior. These plaques, also known as this plaque here, this is the beta amyloid plaque. This is a buildup of protein that sits outside of the neurons or those cells in our brain. And inside these cells decrease their overall communication. And so what's sort of affected by someone who has Alzheimer's through this buildup of beta amyloid in their brain is those cells stop working, right? They stop sending the messages that are needed to do things like our basic activities of daily living. Then there's these deposits of what we call this tau protein. And what tau does is another protein in our brain that sort of acts like a railroad system throughout the brain, and it carries cells and messages from different parts of your brain. And what happens in the brain of someone with Alzheimer's disease is that imagine that the track that it takes, like a railroad track, gets bent in some way. Just like a train wouldn't move, the tau protein doesn't go where it needs to go as well. And the result of that, as you can see, is some really significant neurodegeneration. And with this illustration here, where you see this left side, which would be an illustration of a healthy brain versus someone who has advanced Alzheimer's, there's some pretty significant differences between the two. And I like to show this this image for a couple of reasons. One is that it really helps to illustrate this is a biological change that's happening to the brain, right? This is a physical change that's happening to the brain. And hopefully it helps people who know someone who has Alzheimer's or dementia understand why things like short-term memory recall, difficulty performing familiar tasks can be such a challenge because there is such a disruption within that brain. Now, what we're learning over time is what really puts us in greater impact of, what really puts us at a greater risk of developing cognitive decline or dementia. So I'm going to start with the left side of our screen here, which are these fun things we call non-modifiable risk factors. Of course, those are the things we can't change, right? They're non-modifiable. Things like age. We're all getting older every day. Every time I hear someone read my bio and it mentions that I graduated from college in 1993, to me, that feels like it was just yesterday, but alas, it was now almost 30 years ago. I'm getting older every day. We all are. And we can't control things like our genetics, our race and ethnicity, our sex, or our gender. Those are things that put people at increased risk. So 1 in 8 over the age of 65 will develop Alzheimer's disease. 1 in 3 over the age of 85 will develop Alzheimer's disease. We know that people who have certain genes are at an increased risk of developing Alzheimer's. We know that genetics isn't really the whole story, though. And actually, with the exception of the dominantly inherited gene, most genetic risks plays less than 5%, plays less than 5% of a part in your risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. The genes are a little tricky. The one we talk about most is something called the APOE4 gene. People can have 1, 2, or 0 copies of that gene. And as you would imagine, if you have 0, you're at the least risk. If you have 1, you're at a little bit more risk. If you have 2, you're at a higher risk. But we also know that there are people who have 2 copies of that gene and never develop Alzheimer's disease, and people who have no copies of it and develop Alzheimer's disease. So it's only playing a role in impacting risk, not inevitability. It's another reason why we are cautious about recommending genetic testing that's not done through an institution where you can get genetic counseling, so you truly understand what having copies of these genes might mean. And of course, women are more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease than men. The theory had always been for a long time that women live longer. And I mentioned about how age is our biggest risk factor. However, we're learning that there may be hormonal differences between men and women, life experiences like pregnancies and miscarriages that might be also playing a role in someone's risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So it might not be just as simple as the fact that we're living longer. And we know that our race plays a role in our impact of risk. African Americans are twice as likely to develop Alzheimer's disease over whites, and Latinos are 1.5 times more likely. There's a lot of research that's going on to really try and understand that with really understanding also how genetics plays a role in that, how health equity might play a role, socioeconomic status, etc. So then there's this right side of our little circle here, which talks about the things that we might have some control over. And I'm saying might because I think there are some things on this list that are technically modifiable. However, they may not be as modifiable, or it might not be as simple as just modifying that risk factor. For example, where you live, those environmental lifestyle factors. We're learning about pollution in cities and how that might impact our risk. Well, I mean, it would be nice to say that people could just move anywhere to get out of those cities that might put you at a higher risk because of air pollution levels. But it's not quite that simple, right? You live where you live because of your work or because of where you've grown up or where your family is. So while it's technically modifiable, we know that some people just have no control over where they live. But some of these other things we do have, and some of them are fun, like education and learning. And no better place to talk about that than with all of you here from OLLI. Some of them are common sense, like substance use. Drugs and alcohol put us at an increased risk. Things like brain injury, traumatic brain injuries are putting people at an increased risk. Some of them are really fun to talk about, especially during the lunch hour, like eating better and our physical activity, our cardiovascular health. We're learning more and more about the important role that sleep plays as we age. And we look at sleep from in two ways. One is thinking of just a good night's sleep where you're getting uninterrupted sleep or less interrupted sleep versus sleep issues like sleep apnea. If you have sleep apnea, you have a 30% increased risk of developing dementia. So you should really think about some of those things that you might be not thinking have an impact beyond the actual issue, and really talk to your doctor about that. And then, of course, there's things like cognitive and social engagement. Those are a little bit more fun, like the education, but we'll talk in detail about a couple of these as we go through with some actual evidence that's been built around them. And we also know that it's really important to study risk from all of these angles, not just age, not just genetics, not just race, ethnicity, gender, but looking at all of these other angles as well. And so that's why I always finish that slide talking about it is an exciting time in research. And I know that it's sometimes hard to think about that when you hear about clinical trial failures and you think about the fact that the first case of Alzheimer's was diagnosed in 1906 by a German physician named Alois Alzheimer. He had a patient who was 52 years old who was exhibiting signs that at the time were thought to be psychiatric. And he saw something in her that was different than his normal psychiatric patients. And so he had studied her over time. There are some great journal entries from some of his case notes on her where he asks her questions that you would get today in a clinical setting if you were being evaluated for cognition, like, what is your surname? What is your first name? And she would answer the same answer for both questions, not being able to distinguish the difference between what's a surname or a first name and a last name. He asked once the question about where she lives, and her response was, "You know where I've been." Again, something that someone who's in the sort of moderate stages of the disease, who's still able to cover a little bit, can do pretty easily. And what he saw was that this was not indicative of what she had been diagnosed with. And so he studied her for some time, and when she passed away, he was able to really do an autopsy of her brain. And he was the person who established those hallmarks that we now know today of that amyloid plaque and the tau protein in the brain, what we call those hallmarks of Alzheimer's, of course, the disease that was then named after him. With all that said, It's been a long time since 1906. And so here we are, 100 something years later, and we're still sometimes feel like we're not any closer. But let me tell you, we really are. And hopefully I'll be able to put some of that together for you so that you can see it. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about early detection and diagnosis, because to me, this is where we've made the fastest progress over the last 5 years. So it goes without saying, I think, that an early diagnosis can really help individuals understand their symptoms and explore treatment options to prevent future complications. An early diagnosis can help people who are diagnosed with Alzheimer's or dementia make planning decisions and be part of those planning decisions with their family. It allows them to access potentially better care services and possibly even participate in clinical trials. We know that these clinical trials are playing an enormous role in helping us to find the newest and best treatments, and even potentially in the future, a cure. We also know that participating in a clinical trial has many benefits in terms of maximizing an individual's healthcare and their ability to potentially receive one of the first and maybe even first treatments, and maybe even notice treatments that would be that are not yet approved by the FDA. But today, the way that we're diagnosed is typically not what we call early and timely. And so what we mean by those two words is early, meaning in the early stages of the disease, where you could explore those treatment options, where you are making decisions about your own health outcomes. Timely means that it shouldn't have to take 6 months to get a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. And the reason it sometimes takes that long is because today what we do is essentially rule out everything else that could be causing the signs of cognitive loss. So typically what someone does if they suspect that they or their loved one might have something wrong with their memory is they start oftentimes with their family care practitioner, who could do a series of tests like a mini mental state exam or different cognitive tests that are testing short-term memory. When we think back to those earlier slides where we look at the buildup of plaque and the tangles in the brain and what that's doing to our cognition, it's mostly impacting our short-term memory. Our short-term memory, that's the important one, right? That tells us what we had for breakfast and whether we took our medication, whether we turned the stove on, what time our appointment is today. Our long-term memory is not usually impacted as early or even at all for some people. And so we're testing these things in a clinical setting by some cognitive tests that help to show whether or not short-term memory is doing okay. We're also going to rule out other things that could be causing the cognitive symptoms. So we might get an MRI where they're looking to see if there has been any evidence of a stroke, or to see if there are any tumors on the brain that could be causing the changes. We might get blood work done so we can see if there's an infection that could be causing the confusion. Anything that might be off with our lab work that could be causing these symptoms. And they're going to interview both the person who has the symptoms as well as sometimes caregivers and kind of become little detectives at trying to understand what might be going on with that person. When all is said and done, they will give potentially a probable diagnosis of Alzheimer's if everything looks by the book, sort of that textbook definition of what a cognitive assessment might look like for someone in the early to moderate stages of dementia. What's exciting is that we have something that's changing the game when it comes to early detection and diagnosis, and that's something called biomarkers. Biomarker technology are really changing this field and helping not only the potential clinical future, but are helping the research future today. These tools are changing our experience, will change our experience in the physician's office, but also ensuring that people that are enrolled in clinical trials today are enrolled in the right trial for the right therapeutic. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. There are some medications right now that are in clinical trial that are addressing amyloid, the amyloid in the brain, specific to Alzheimer's disease. So 5 or 10 years ago, if you were going to qualify for that clinical trial, you would get the same sort of cognitive testing that we do in physician offices today. So we're ruling out, right? There was no way to really ensure that someone had amyloid in the brain to know that that was the right therapeutic for them. Well, biomarkers are changing that game. And biomarkers, it's probably a term you're familiar with. Essentially, it's a biological piece of you that is used to understand your risk for all kinds of different diseases. So, for example, if you are at risk for heart disease, they might be measuring your cholesterol in your blood. And if you are at risk for diabetes, they're going to be looking at your blood to look at what those blood sugars look like in your blood system. There are a few emerging biomarkers that are really interesting. One is the use of scans, this PET scan. So this is a PET scan image here on the left-hand side of your screen. And PET scans, or positron emissions tomography, are really able to show what's working and not working in the brain. And these different colors all have a point of reference for physicians to understand where there might be instances of amyloid. And what's really exciting now is there's even a tau amyloid. There's a tau PET scan. So we have two different tests, or two different tracers that are used in these PET scans to show us the evidence of either beta amyloid or the tau protein in a brain. Now, today, these scans are only being used in clinical trials, but the hope is to get us to the point where they could be used in a clinical setting and covered by insurance. They could be used today in a clinical setting if you would like to pay for them out of pocket, but these tests are very expensive and are not easily available to everyone. And that's where blood is really coming up as an emerging science here. Because if you think about some of the things that have been used before, in the past, we've used things like cerebral spinal fluid taps. So you get a spinal tap in your back, right? They're able to extract the cerebral spinal fluid, and they can test that for biomarkers. Invasive. And you've got a PET scan. Expensive. Then you have a blood test. How many, I can't see the chat, so I'm, or your faces to know, if I were to ask the question, how many of you have had a blood test in the last 1 to 2 years? My guess is that probably the majority of us have, for one reason or another. We can get them done in our local doctor's office. They're mostly not invasive, and unless you're really afraid of needles, and some people might argue with me about that piece, but compared to having a spinal tap in the back or having to sit through an invasive PET scan with a tracer in us, a blood test is pretty less invasive. It's also something that is showing in clinical trials to be just as, or as close as accurate as the PET scans are in actually diagnosing the presence of a disease biology like the amyloid plaque and being able to diagnose Alzheimer's. So important to know that blood tests are not available today in our clinical settings. Over the last several years, we've seen some studies come out of the Alzheimer's Association International Conference that's showing how these are being regulated and validated. And the next sort of stage in this clinical trials to get it into physician's office is then what do you do once you have the blood drawn? It's interesting to the things you probably, or maybe you do think of them. I hadn't thought about it when you get a blood test and it goes in the vial. What happens there? What kind of a container is it stored in? Where is it stored? How is it transported for testing? How is it tested? The temperature, the type of material it's stored in, all of those things can impact the outcome of the test. And so that's sort of the next piece of this to really help us be able to get this to a place where it's accessible in our clinicians' offices for when we really do have a need to for timely and accurate diagnosis. Some other emerging markers, of course, retinal scans. Again, these are all in sort of some of the early stages of clinical trials to show how these kinds of emerging markers can be used in a clinical setting in the future. And what it's showing us is that it's potential for us to modernize the way we diagnose Alzheimer's and dementia. So, you know, over here on the right-hand side is what I talked about, right? This is where we're just going on the history and the cognition of both the person who's being evaluated as well as their care circle, to a place where we can use biomarkers to definitively know whether or not someone has the presence of a disease in their blood, in their system. What is really exciting about this and why it's important for future research and for future therapeutics is that when we talk about these biological changes that are happening in the brain, they're happening probably 20 years or more before the cognitive symptoms are actually present. So if you're in your 50s and you're going to develop the disease in your 70s, in your 50s, those changes are already starting to happen to the brain. So when we get to that point where there's a treatment that can actually either stop that progression in the brain, think how biomarkers will be used then, 20 years earlier, to be able to show the presence in the brain and be able to stop the progression so that we don't develop the cognitive symptoms. It's really kind of remarkable to think about. And just again, I sort of already talked about this with my earlier slide. But one of the reasons brain PET scans are really important is they are being studied with something called the IDEAS trial. This is a trial that's now concluded, but it was done in partnership with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, as well as the American College of Radiology and the Alzheimer's Association, to try and understand that in some of these uncertain cases, these cases where it's not textbook, remember I alluded to that earlier, could the results of a PET scan actually make changes in a patient management? And would this translate into improved medical outcomes? So what the first stage of this study looked at, this was a study that looked at using these PET imaging scans in over 18,000 Medicare beneficiaries that were coming into physician's office. They had a complaint of some sort of impairment, but they did not know the cause of it. And what they were able to really understand from this was, particularly with patients that had a positive amyloid PET scan, the rate of amyloid of Alzheimer's diagnosis has increased from 80% before they had the PET scan to 95% after they had the PET scan, meaning prior to the PET scan, less people were accurately diagnosed. Now, I think what's even more exciting and sort of provides the rationalization for why these scans are so much better than history and cognition, right? History and physical, is that patients that actually received a negative amyloid scan got their diagnosis changed. Before the PET scan, 71% pre-PET decreased to 10% post-PET scan, meaning that all of these people that were given an Alzheimer's diagnosis really did not have the presence of amyloid in their brain, and therefore there was something else that was causing the cognition changes. We know that people found that they were able to make better healthcare decisions. They were able to think about those clinical care plans that they were that they needed to put into place. So it really did improve health outcomes. Now, one of the other aims of this is really to ensure that it saves money over time. We're not quite there really being able to see the longitudinal outcomes of whether or not it will save on hospitalizations, on urgent hospitalizations, things like that. But you can see just from these early results that having something that's definitive versus something that's speculative is certainly improving health outcomes. In one way or another, you could argue that even, knowing exactly what it is you have, even if you are on the side of having a positive amyloid scan, is a better health outcome than not knowing what's causing your cognitive changes. What's really exciting about this is we're building upon it with an extension of this study called New Ideas. And this is going to really ensure that we're including people of diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds, and continue to study some of these people over time. And so we want to introduce another 7,000 participants. What's also exciting about this study is, you heard me mention the first study was for Medicare beneficiaries. So everybody was 65 years of age or older, whereas in this particular study, people with younger onset would be eligible to participate in this trial as well. So this has just started recruiting, and we're excited about participating in this and really seeing how we can demonstrate a case for the need for coverage for these important tests that cost a lot of money. And I'd mentioned about the blood tests. This is just some of the data behind what they're doing to really validate both beta amyloid as well as the tau protein in blood. And like I said, what they do is then compare it to a PET scan, so they can really sort of test for that sort of accuracy. So it's really exciting to see. Now, we also have a lot of things happening right now in the area of effective treatments. So to give you just sort of an idea of the drug development process, it can take many, many decades before a therapy can come to market. And what you'll see here is that what that pipeline looks like, and how long it can sometimes take to get from one place to the other, and why this is sometimes such a complicated race to win. So laboratories spend years in what we call this preclinical phase. This is where they're testing their hypothesis. This is done with cellular or animal models before you can ever get to that sort of phase 1 of testing, which typically lasts months, where they're actually able to test on human volunteers. And what they're looking for in this phase 1, which is usually a small study, they're looking for side effects, they're looking for risks, safety, overall safety of that therapeutic intervention. If that is successful, then that trial phases into what we call phase 2. This can last anywhere from months to years, depending on the clinical trial. This is going to expand to more, maybe a few hundred, from sort of 10 or 20 to a few hundred. And this is, in addition to the safety, this is where they're actually able to test different hypotheses of dosing. So they might have 2 arms of an intervention at different milligrams, different doses of the medication, to see if one has better impact than the other. They're also looking to see if one carries more risks than the other. After the conclusion of phase 3 is where we see our trials expand to what we call these phase 3 trials, and these also can last years, if not longer. What's exciting about phase 3 is this is where we really see the expansion of the number of people that are participating in the trials. Because if you think about all the things that could impact efficacy of a medication of one person over the next, you need masses, right? So when we talk about a good phase 3 clinical trial, you're talking about thousands and thousands of people I would, or it's just to say 1,000, 2,000 of people, right? You want a good clinical trial, 8, 900, 1,000 people, something like that, that really is going to test all of the potential aspects of that drug. And then once a drug then sees some success in this phase 3, the therapeutic will be decided whether or not that therapeutic gets submitted to the Food and Drug Administration for its review. And to give you sort of a sense of what's happening right now, most all of these mechanisms are being currently tested in clinical trials today. So I think if you think back 25 years ago to what was really being tested in clinical trials, due to lots of different reasons, just sort of the advancement of science and certainly funding for Alzheimer's and dementia research, there was really a lot of focus on amyloid beta and on tau. And that was about it. I mean, not totally, but that was sort of, those were the main two things that you heard about. And now you can see here, there's really no stone being left unturned. We're looking at neuroinflammation is probably one of the biggest things that has a lot of excitement around really understanding how inflammation impacts risk of dementia. Looking at vascular stress, looking at neurotransmitters, looking at cellular communication, how all of this works together. There's about 100 unique therapies that are being tested today that are all targeting multiple aspects of the Alzheimer's disease biology. So what I want to do for the next few slides is share a little bit about what came out of the Alzheimer's Association International Conference. As I mentioned, it was held in San Diego the first week of August, and there were 10,000 of the world's greatest scientists either attending in person, about 5,000 in person, or virtually. And since the pandemic, we've really been able to make that virtual option available for many countries that wouldn't have access to attend this type of a international conference. So the first study that I'm going to talk about is really talking about the impacts of COVID-19 and the pandemic on memory and thinking. And this sort of goes around that thought around inflammation and where information is being studied. We've, since the beginning of the pandemic, have been curious about what long-term impacts of COVID-19 might have on memory and thinking. And just because of the nature of some of the severity of the illnesses and the symptoms of the illness, I think there was a real need to understand this novel virus on its impact on the brain. And so the Alzheimer's Association, in partnership with many organizations, including the World Health Organization, has come together to really study COVID-19 in the brain. One of the earliest research results that we have, a lot of this is ongoing, is really looking at this persistent loss of smell. And so it is thought to be that if you have a persistent loss of smell having had COVID-19, that may be a better predictor of long-term cognitive impairment over time than perhaps someone who had a really severe case of COVID-19 but hasn't had any long-term effects. And so smell in particular is one of those inflammatory responses that seems to show that if you do have that persistent loss of smell, you may have a higher risk of long-term cognitive impairment as a result of COVID-19. So again, this is not related specifically to Alzheimer's, but more around cognitive impairment. Now, additionally, this work is also looking at just the pandemic in general, less about the virus, but more about the impact of isolation and the outcomes of isolation. And what they found was that women who were not working and who came from a lower socioeconomic status during the pandemic have been associated with having more cognitive symptoms now. And so this is something, when you start to think about health equity and the impact of socioeconomic status on our risk of dementia, this is something that's really needs not only research behind it, but attention paid to it to ensure that everybody has an equal playing ground, and that people shouldn't be at risk of developing dementia because their socioeconomic status is lower. But there's a lot of research showing us that that this happens to be the case. And so really, I think what we're learning is that there's certainly impact or effects from COVID-19 on our memory and thinking. Now, it wasn't all bad news. And I think, as you can imagine, when we think about some of those risk factors that we talked about earlier, positive life changes during the pandemic might improve our memory and thinking, right? And we know that a lot of people started baking sourdough bread, and they also made a conscious effort to be socially connected to people. Because so much of our normal socialization was taken away from us during the pandemic, we went out of our way to put ourselves in situations where we weren't, even if it was through Zoom, where we weren't by ourselves. People were reading more. They were getting out and exercising and doing things outside safely. And there has been some reports that has had a positive life change and impact on our memory and thinking in a good way, which is really great to hear. So there's definitely more research needed in this. And as I mentioned in that previous slide, inflammation is something that is being highly researched because of the potential for the connection. And I think that it's just exciting to see that we're looking at things that are beyond the sort of normal realm of our research as well. And there's really been this great focus on risk reduction and what we can do to decrease our risk of dementia today. We know that about up to 40% of dementia cases could be prevented or delayed by targeting modifiable risk factors. We also know that research is suggesting that doing many of these things together has the potential for the most impact. I'm going to take you through a couple of studies that actually looked at singular things and then talk about what happens when we put them all together. So the first study that came out from AAIC really looked at this concept of what we eat and what could change our brains. So this particular study looked at what we call ultra processed foods. And as you can imagine, ultra processed foods are fast foods, Twinkies, things that are high in sugar, things that have lots of ingredients on them that you probably can't read the names of. Those are considered to be ultra processed foods. And what this study found was that people whose daily caloric intake of these processed foods was more than 25% daily were associated with a 28% faster decline in global cognitive scores. So when they did the cognitive testings, 28% had a more rapid decline. Now, what's concerning is that about 50% of American diets make up these ultra processed foods. And so, I think it's really, we talk about, for years, you are what you eat. We're getting more and more of the evidence now to show that these ultra processed foods not only have impact on our heart and on heart disease and all of the things associated with cardiovascular risk factors, but also on the potential for brain health as well. The second study that I want to talk about is something called the Exert Study. And what's exciting about this study is a couple of things. One is that this was a study conducted on people who had already been diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment. So we talked about mild cognitive impairment in that continuum slide. And we talked about if you can prevent new cases of mild cognitive impairment, you can prevent new cases of dementia. So it's really important to understand how we can stall cognitive decline until we find that effective treatment. So what Exert did was take participants and studied them in two different arms of exercise. One arm kept with this sort of aerobic intervention. So aerobic exercise has found to sort of have the most potential benefit for brain health when we've done some of these exercise trials in the past. And, we've read about studies that have shown that if you do sort of 30 to 40 minutes of aerobic exercise where you're getting your heart rate up and your that rate of exertion up, 3 to 4 times a week, that has the potential best protection for your brain. So there was that arm of the study, but then they introduced a new arm of the study where they really focused more on stretching and balance. Now, I want to reiterate this by saying both aerobic and stretching and balance are really the best prescription for good physical health when it comes to brain health. But what was interesting about this study in particular is for people who were sedentary and had mild cognitive impairment, both arms stalled cognitive decline. So it wasn't just the aerobic exercise that had the potential to protect our brain health, that this potential for stretching and balance might be protective as well. And so that's really exciting to hear about when you think about people who have mild cognitive impairment or who are at risk of developing dementia. 30 to 40 minutes, 3 to 5 times a week of cardiovascular exercise might not be physically possible. They might have other physical lack of physical ability to be able to do that. And so it's not all or nothing. It means that you could potentially do this stretching and balance where it's safer and you can do it from a chair and you don't have to be able to, if you've got knee issues or balance issues, you don't have to be able to, run on a treadmill for 30 minutes and still can protect our brain health. So that was really exciting. And this study was conducted by Dr. Laura Baker, who is the principal investigator for the US Pointer study, which I'll talk about in just a minute. Now, this is not a new study, but I like to include this slide all the time. This came out a few years ago, because this is one of those things that really reiterates for me, if you take one thing away, from this presentation, it's about blood pressure. So the Sprint Mind study was the first study to demonstrate the reduction of new cases of cognitive impairment. People that were enrolled in this trial were over the age of 50. There was 9,000 of them, and they were at risk of developing dementia. So most typically, they either had high blood pressure, they might have had diabetes, and so they were enrolled in one of two arms in this trial. The first arm of the trial kept people's blood pressure at what was then considered to be normal blood pressure, 140 systolic. The second arm of this trial helped to reduce their systolic blood pressure to 120, and that could either be through diet and exercise or through medication. So people were allowed to take a blood pressure medication on this trial to keep that systolic blood pressure level at about 120. What they found from this study was that there was a dramatic reduction of small vessel disease on an MRI that equated to a 19% reduced risk of developing mild cognitive impairment, a 17% reduced risk for developing dementia, and a 15% reduced risk when looking at both mild cognitive impairment and dementia together. Now, again, I'm going to refer you back to that continuum slide and why I put that slide in there. If you can prevent new cases of mild cognitive impairment, you can prevent new cases of dementia. And so with a 19% reduced risk of developing mild cognitive impairment, this is an important study. And so what we want to do, though, this was a 7-year study. We want to be able to look at these people for a little bit longer than seven years to see what kind of impact this has on dementia risk. And so we're currently being funded, or the study is currently being funded by both the Alzheimer's Association and the National Institute on Health for Sprint Mind 2.0, which is a continuation of the Sprint Mind study, which will include some of the people that were in the original study, as well as some new participants as well. And then I mentioned about the principal investigator for US Pointer, which is a study that's happening throughout the United States that's pulling all of these lifestyle interventions together. And it's called the US Study to Protect Brain Health Through Lifestyle Interventions to Reduce Risk. It's a mouthful, so we just call it US Pointer. And what US Pointer is doing is, again, not putting no intervention or intervention. There's 2 arms to this intervention. And this is where either group will either be self-guided through the curriculum, or they will have a structured intervention where they're really kind of given a lot of hand-holding, weekly meetings, accountability check-ins. But this is pulling all of those pieces together that we've been talking about. So it's the physical exercise, which includes both cardiovascular cardio or aerobic exercise, as well as balance and strength training. But it's also looking at diet, and in particular, we're using the MIND diet, which is a modification between the DASH diet and the Mediterranean diet, which looks at things like dark green leafy vegetables and omega-3 fatty acids and berries and almonds, nuts, lean meats. And what's also good about the MIND diet is it accounts for the fact that it's not all or nothing. It's about limiting the bad stuff, including those ultra processed foods, and having more of the good stuff like whole grains and berries and nuts and dark green leafy vegetables and good fats. It's also looking at cognitive engagement and intellectual engagement, as well as that health coaching. So blood sugar, cholesterol, high blood pressure, and managing those things as well. This study is being done at 5 sites across the United States, including here in Northern California at the University of California at Davis through the principal investigator, Dr. Rachel Whitmer, here in Sacramento, in the greater Sacramento area. And we're almost done with recruitment of this trial, which is exciting because once we're finished with recruitment, then those 2,000 participants will be seen for the last 2 years. And by the end of those 2 years, we hope to really show that we can lead the way in developing accessible and sustainable community-based programs for prevention of dementia. Now, in addition, the National Institute on Aging is supporting what we call ancillary studies. These are studies that participants in either arm can opt into participating in. One is looking at imaging, one is looking at neurovascular, one is looking at sleep, and one is looking at that gut health and the connection between gut health and brain health. So that's kind of exciting as well to see. And I think what's great about this study is that we're really starting to see that people are figuring out how to make these changes and keep them even once their 2 years is over, which is a really great thing as well. So, I think what's important is we've got to look at this from every angle. We've got to look at inclusion of individuals who are underrepresented, from underrepresented backgrounds, so that we truly can find a clinical, a therapeutic intervention that helps everybody. But there is a lot currently being studied. So this just kind of gives you the landscape of the number of trials that are being studied in each of these categories. And you can see, obviously, Alzheimer's disease is the most, because it is the most common type of dementia. But I love that there's so many studies looking at mild cognitive impairment, vascular dementia, as well as other types of dementia. And of course, if you're interested in getting involved in research, Trial Match is a great way to connect you to a clinical trial that's happening close to you. There's lots of clinical trials for healthy individuals as well, and some of this can be done on the phone, can be done through Zoom. You don't necessarily have to be near a clinical site to participate in those studies, and a lot of caregiving studies as well. I always talk about the fact that while this is all great and we need to find an effective treatment or cure, the reality is for those 6 million Americans who are currently living with Alzheimer's or dementia, the chances of this effective treatment, even if we discovered it tomorrow, working for them in the progression that they are is probably not going to happen. And so for them, high quality of care, ensuring that they get the best care and support is absolutely important. And that involves not just caregiving techniques, but things like identifying the right types of medications to give for behavioral symptoms that will not be detrimental to someone who has dementia. So that's really encouraging to see those are being studied as well. And why we talk a lot about risk reduction, it's for this slide right here. And we think that in the future, as I alluded to before, that treatment will likely include a combination of whatever effective medicines come down the line, as well as these risk reduction strategies. And I always think back to what we've learned about risk reduction over time. And I think about when I was a child and we rode bicycles without helmets and we skied without helmets. And I would say that even probably for the first 10 or so years of my life, we sat in the backseat of the car without a seatbelt on. Now we don't do those things. We've learned what it takes to reduce our risk of certain injuries. And that's where we are with Alzheimer's disease and dementia. We are learning what these risk reduction strategies can do that everybody can be taking part of. And we should be doing these things to decrease our risk. And whether that is because it delays the onset of the disease, or whether it's because we can prevent the disease in the future, that's the goal. But you can see here that delaying the onset of the disease by 5 years would have a significant impact on the number of people that would not develop Alzheimer's disease in the future. And so it's encouraging to see that even as some of the science feels slow, we're making these changes in the right direction to help the trajectory of Alzheimer's disease. I know I covered a lot of stuff and not a lot of stuff, just because there's so much going on. If you are interested at all in the research, I would highly recommend you download the Science Hub app from the Apple Store or Google Play. A great way to kind of get the latest on Alzheimer's and dementia research, as well as some of the science behind it. For us, science is everything, and we want to make sure that people really understand what it is that makes up a study and why one study works over another or doesn't work over another. It's important to see that. And then there's also other resources available for you, including, we have a number of educational programs that are available on ALZ.org or ALZ.org/CRF for Community Resource Finder. Easiest thing to do is just call our 24/7 helpline, 800-272-3900. If you have questions, if you want to get more information or find out what's going on. At this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I think before we go to questions, maybe, oh, I don't know. Have I not been sharing my screen this whole time? It seems to have gone away.
You've been sharing your screen.
Okay.
Yeah, we just want to know if the slides were available.
Say that again.
They wanted to know if your slides are available.
Yeah, absolutely. I will send them, Jane, to you this afternoon. I'll make them available to everybody. And I was thinking maybe before we did questions, Kim, do you and Lynn want to go from here, and then we can kind of take questions together, and it'll give me a chance to get caught up in the chat.
Sounds good. That's great. All right, I'll share my screen here. All right, here we go. So Lynn McKenna is going to start us off here. She's one of our presenters today too. She's going to talk about advocacy and AIM. And you're on mute.
All right, there we go. So AIM stands for the Alzheimer's Impact Movement, and AIM is the political arm of the Alzheimer's Association. So we all know that if you are trying to procure funds from state or federal governments, you have to have a lobbying your cause. So AIM is the group that does this. And because of AIM, over the last several years, we've seen an increase in funding for Alzheimer's research. So on this slide, you can see from 2013 up until this year, how much the funding has increased. And this funding goes to the National Institute of Health, and they are the ones who oversee a lot of the dispersion of the funds for Alzheimer's research. So by the end of this year, the funding will be $3.5 billion, which is a huge amount of money. But if you can remember the slide that Claire showed, how much it's costing us and how much caregivers are giving of their time and love for their family members, the dollar amount, it's just a drop in the bucket. So right now, the Alzheimer's Association has two bills that they have or are presenting to the federal legislation. One of them is the National Alzheimer's Project Act, Reauthorization Act. So in this bill is set to sunset in 2025. And the Reauthorization Act will continue the work. This is the plan that the federal government came up with to have Alzheimer's research and funding. And then a couple of other things that this new piece of legislation will include, that it will add new federal representatives to the NAPA Advisory Council. They will be from the Department of Justice, Social Security Administration, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency. This new act would also require that the national plan include recommendations on reducing disparities among the underserved populations. And we all know this came to the forefront with COVID. There was a wide discrepancy in medical care and services available to different populations in our country. So they would be addressing that issue. And it would also ensure that the NAPA Act includes efforts to promote healthy aging, risk reduction, and be consistent with the new goal. And that ties in a lot with what Claire was just talking about. The second bill that's being introduced is called the Alzheimer's Accountability and Investment Act. And in 2022, we know that Medicare and Medicaid costs for Alzheimer's was about $206 billion. That basically represents $1 in every $6 Medicare spends goes to Alzheimer's care. And these costs are only going to increase. So this bill would see, given this financial burden on government budgets, a commitment to Alzheimer's research today will yield savings down the road tomorrow. And then the Alzheimer's Accountability and Investment Act would maintain the Alzheimer's bypass budget process. That's a very complicated process of how you can ask for funding. I won't go into that now because it'll probably take me 15 minutes to try to explain it. But it's a way that when you ask for a certain amount of money, then when it goes to the different committees, they can't alter that amount of money and decrease it or change it. So it's very important to have that be the same. So you can join AIM. It's $20 a year. AIM is a 501c4 nonprofit, so you cannot deduct the $20 dues from your federal income tax because it's for political purposes. And even if you don't want to join AIM, one of the things we're trying to do is build kind of a database of people up here in Humboldt County that would be willing to be on an email list, that when we have pending legislation or pending issues before the state or federal legislation, we could send out an email to you and you would respond by contacting our local elected officials or our state and federal officials, asking them for their support. So if this is something you'd be interested in doing, if you could let Jane or Kim know and get us your name and email address. We're working on building this database. And it's really important because our legislators do pay attention. And when their constituents say, hey, this is an important issue to us, we need your support, they do see how many people call in and respond to, that call. So if you're not interested in being on the real political end with the finances, this is another way that you could help, just encouraging our legislators to support different legislation that benefits all of us. Okay.
Thank you, Lynn. Is that it on advocacy? All right, we'll switch over here to the walk. So a great way to get involved with the Alzheimer's Association is by participating in our local walk to End Alzheimer. So this event's held annually in over 600 communities nationwide. So the Humboldt County Walk is going to be on Saturday, October 8th. We're thrilled to be back at the Adorni Center. So the last couple of years, we've a format where we've just told folks to walk from their community or walk from their homes, just trying to keep everybody safe, but we can actually gather this year, so we're thrilled about that. The Alzheimer's Association Walk to End Alzheimer's, this is the world's largest fundraiser for Alzheimer's care, support, and research. So it's a great way to connect with others that are impacted by the disease and to make a difference in the community. When you show up to walk, especially for folks, families, and folks with the disease, to see all the people that are out there supporting them is huge. So there's still a lot of stigma around the disease. So they're thrilled when people come out. So how can you get involved? It's pretty easy. So you can start or join a team or register as an individual. So recruit your friends, your family, coworkers. Free registration, unlimited team size. You can be a team of 1, you can be a team of 100. So there's a number there you can text, or you can go to our website, actalz.org, Humboldt. You can volunteer at the event. We definitely need a lot of volunteers. We need volunteers on Friday with setup starting at 10. And then on Saturday, we need volunteers from 2 to 3 hours. So I definitely need to know in advance so I can make sure that I put you in a position, a volunteer position, so that your time is well used. So volunteers show up anytime from 8 o'clock on. So anyway, if you're interested in volunteering, you can go once again to our website and click the volunteer button, and then I'll be in touch with you. So, and then you can join the planning committee. So Lynn's on our planning committee. She's our advocacy chairperson. Don't know what I do without her. So this event is definitely planned by volunteers. So I'm a part-time staff person. I oversee this group, but the rest of the folks are all volunteers. So they help in lots of areas. So any questions, you've got my number and email on the screen there. All right, I'm going to stop sharing now, and then we can go to questions.
You've done such a thorough job that there aren't very many questions, but there are a couple in the chat. What are they looking for in the terms of the blood test? Exactly what markers are they looking for when you get a blood test? Is it the presence of tau, or what can they see there that tells you? And the same question with regard to retinal scans. What should you be asking your ophthalmologist or your optometrist?
I think the retinal scans are too early. I think there's right now they're only able to. I think they're only studying the retinal scans in an autopsy. But for the blood test, they're looking at their accumulation of the amyloid plaques. And they're looking specifically at the ratio between 2 types of protein, the A beta 42 and the A beta 40. So they're able to essentially understand these proteins and see the presence of these proteins in a blood test. And I just, again, want to reiterate that they're not available yet for clinical use. I think the blood tests are probably closer for clinical use than we thought they were a year or so ago, but we're probably still talking about 3 to 5 years before they'd be available in your clinical setting, unfortunately.
Yeah. And then are there tests to measure loss of smell?
Yeah. So I put an article in the chat about that. Certainly not something that I'm an expert on, but when I just did a quick review to find that, I found an article that really explains how those clinical assessments are made in a patient setting, but certainly not my area of expertise.
Okay, and then how is mild cognitive impairment different from just memory loss? That is, you can't remember facts as well or quickly.
Yeah, I was glad someone asked that, because I don't spend a lot of time in this particular presentation talking about the warning signs of Alzheimer's and dementia and the difference between normal aging and Alzheimer's or dementia. And so I think with the distinction of mild cognitive impairment, you're going to see some of those similar early warning signs, right? Like short-term memory loss. I think what's really important when we think about Alzheimer's and dementia and these warning signs is what's different to 5 or 10 years ago, or even 2 years ago. What's a change for you? So if you've never been good at remembering people's names, and you don't remember people's names today, that's okay. That's not different for you. But if you've always been good at remembering people's names and now have trouble remembering people's names, that's a sign. If you walk into a room and forget why you walked in there, how many has done that? You're all lying if you don't put your hands up, right? We all have done that. Someone with Alzheimer's or dementia or even mild cognitive impairment might not be able to do some of those fun things like we all do, like retracing our steps. This morning, I had a dream last night about my friend's dog. And I was texting her to tell her about, I let the dog out of the garage and I couldn't catch the dog. This was my dream last night. Don't analyze that for me. I don't want to know what it means. But I could not remember the name. I was trying to text her that I had a dream about her dog and I could not remember the name of her dog. And what do you think I did? What are some of the tricks you do when you're trying to remember a name?
Focus, yeah.
The alphabet, right? You go through the name. Like I started with A and I started go, and I must have had to go through the alphabet like 3 times before I started the B's again. Boomer. Boomer is the name of her dog. That's normal aging, right? Like I just couldn't remember in that instant. Whereas with someone with mild cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's may not be able to use those tricks. The difference between mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's is it's not impacting your ability to do things independently. So with Alzheimer's, you're going to see a progression and a point where, you can't go to the grocery store without someone to help you get all of those things. You're having trouble managing finances and just not able to drive, not able to do those things. With mild cognitive impairment, while the cognition changes may be there, they're not of enough severity that they actually impact our activities of daily living. And so that's why research around mild cognitive impairment is so important, because it could be a catch-all point. And years ago, we did not recognize that it was sort of this precursor to Alzheimer's and dementia. We knew that it put you at an increased risk, but we didn't really recognize that people traveled through mild cognitive impairment before they got to Alzheimer's. Because when I started with the association, mild cognitive impairment was a symptom. It wasn't a clinical diagnosis, and now it has a diagnostic number within the DSM. So it's just research has progressed. That was a long answer to that question. Sorry.
No problem. Do you have a presentation that's more thorough on all the lifestyle changes from diet to exercise to, in other words, defining precisely what the best things are and all the resources that are available online, the books,
Yeah,
people like Bredesen, et cetera. Do you have that kind of a resource available?
Yeah, we do. We have a presentation called Healthy Living for Your Brain and Body, and it is taken from the local research. And what's great about it is it's just being updated to include some of this stuff. So that, I think that would be potentially a good one. And it really kind of goes through and, you know, helps us think about what kind of changes we could be taking in each part of those sort of 4 areas that we could be doing that kind of help us focus on putting some of those into practice.
Do you know when that will be available?
Well, the updated version was supposed to be available now, and they've predicted that maybe within a month. So I would think, like, if we planned something in late fall or maybe early winter, you'd have the new version. I mean, there's a version available now, but I would suggest waiting.
The updated one would be better. So if we did something like for March.
Yep, it will definitely be ready by then.
Yeah, let's plan on doing that.
Great.
All right. Any questions from anybody else? Is there anything I missed? Any hands? Yes, Janice, do you have a question?
Is there any technology being developed to help people with MCI to communicate better? That's something my husband would really like to. He has early stages MCI, and he wants to be able to put down his story, things he wants his family to remember, but he has really trouble using technology, laptops. I got him an iPad. Are there simple programs, do you know, that are being created for that?
There probably are. And I mean, I think there's also things like, there's organizations like StoryCorps who help people put their story on paper or record their story. You know, certainly there's the use of things like, you know, being able to kind of dictate your story, your what you're trying to say, either using a phone or even something as old fashioned as, remember the dictaphones where you would, you know, the little mini tape recorders. But, you know, Janice, I'd love to talk with some of my team who do this a little bit more in depth and maybe have some of the latest stuff. If you'd be willing to have me email you, if you can share your contact information, or if I can send it to Jane, if you'd rather me send it to Jane and she can get it to you, because, you know, off the top of my head, I'm thinking about, like, there's lots of there's things you can do to record your story, but maybe not the technology piece. That's not coming to my mind. Others around the room might have.
Yeah, could you share your email address so that she could possibly?
Oh, that's a great way to do it, Jane. There you go. Look at you thinking for me.
Should I just put it in the chat room, my email?
There, Janice, I put mine in the chat, so why don't you email me, and that way you don't have to share your email.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I think, was it Doug had a
yeah. You mentioned a while ago people who enter another room and can't remember what they were in there for. Duke, I think, did a study a few years ago, and they found that actually was a symptom, and they gave it a name, which I can't remember. But the response is to go back into the original room, and many times you can figure out what you've forgotten.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Doug, that retracing of our steps is a real trigger for our memory and can be a really, really good tool.
And one of the other things that I always have loved, Dr. Bill Fisher told me many years ago, when I said, I'm worried I may be getting Alzheimer, he said, Doug, who was the Viking that ran the wrong way against the 49ers for safety? And I couldn't remember. And he says, tonight at 10 o'clock, you'll be in bed and you'll wake up and say, Jim Marshall.
Yeah.
You don't have Alzheimer's, because a person with Alzheimer's would have forgotten the question. Yeah. And that's a good test for a lot of us.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I think it is those things, right? Like I, it's inevitable that when you hear some of this information, you think about memory concerns, you automatically jump to, oh my gosh, is that me? Like I did that. And our brains are aging just like our knees are aging. Does anyone's knees work the same way they did 40 years ago? Because mine sure as heck don't, right? Our brains are aging the same way. I think where there's cause for concern is where it really is impacting your ability to do things independently and to really, it's really impacting your daily life. I think that's when there's a concern.
Any other questions?
I think Mandy has her hand up.
I wanted to throw out there that I have had my dad's brother died of Alzheimer's. My mom has Alzheimer's. Dad died a month after mom was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, but before the pandemic. And then my mom had to live in my art room through the pandemic. And I have been a caregiver unpaid, and stress upon stress upon stress. And as my memory has gotten worse, I had testing done locally as much as they would allow. And the neuroscientist or whoever neuropsychologist perhaps, that looked at a brain scan of me said, "It's normal. What more do you want?" And I said, "Well, I'd like to see the picture. I don't know what part of my brain is normal and what part of what I'm forgetting." And he said, "My diagnosis is that you've got too much weight and that you're trying to put a 20-pound bag of grain into a 10-pound bag." And
yeah, so I think I don't know if you all lost Mandy there, but I think, her point is a great
computer
one.
unstable. Please.
Yeah, we lost you for a little bit there, Mandy, but I think I got what you're
saying. I can put it in chat, but the other thing that I used Redwood about the elder that came to church, and the minister invited her down and said, "Can you tell us, do you ever think about the hereafter?" And she says, "Yes, all the time." "Oh, well, do tell." Well, I walk into the kitchen and I think, what am I hereafter? And I get a punchline instead of getting mad at myself. So think about the hereafter, and we'll all be pious,
Well, and I think, Mandy, I think you got that you were cutting out a little bit, but your point was a good one, which was, what we're doing today compared to what older adults did 30 years ago. There's far more going on. There's more competing for your attention. There's technology that's booming at us all the time. That's, sort of overstimulating us.
A new computer so I wouldn't be unstable, and then they changed suddenly to Optimum, and it's not stable anymore.
Yeah, now it's not working. But I think we're busier than we ever used to be, and so it's okay to. I liked the analogy you gave about you're trying to put too much in to the vessel, right? It's too much going on. And my friend always used to joke about that, and we thought she was being goofy, but it's true. She's like, I have to let go of something else in my brain for something new to come in. And I think it's okay for us to give ourselves permission to do that, because retirement is not what it was 30 years ago, where people were not doing anything. People are busier now in retirement than I think they were when they weren't in retirement. My 83-year-old father sometimes works longer weeks than I do, longer days than I do. So I think it's a great point and a great thing to mention.
I also want to point out that they have discovered that there are certain things going on in your world that can cause you to act as if that can affect your brain effectiveness, that make you appear to be forgetful. And one is stress. And we have tons and tons of stress and tons of impact, just as Mandy pointed out. And we still try to multitask. And I mean, they've shown that multitasking just doesn't work. If you did things in sequence, you'd do both of them better than if you try to do them both at the same time or multiple things at the same time. So we have to learn to adjust to things like that and not try to be superhuman.
Yeah.
But UTIs can cause problems like that. Going into the hospital and having experienced delirium because you're in a new environment and you're not in your familiar environment, all of these things can make you look like you have Alzheimer's when you don't.
Yeah.
So they're learning so much about this, and that's why I really look forward to having another presentation about lifestyle issues that can be addressed to give you more potential for saving your brain, which we all want to do.
Yeah.
Keep coming to OLLI Brown Bag Lunch presentations.
Right.
It matters. We love having you here, and thank you ever so much. And thank you to our speakers. You've been great. We really appreciate this update, and we'll look forward to seeing you again sometime in the spring. And feel free, if you would, to come and attend our classes. We've got a great bunch of them, and we'd really enjoy having you attend and keep our program strong. So thanks ever so much. And if you can bring other members on board, you know, people who've been members before or other members of your family, hey, bring them on. We need to get our membership back up to 1,000, where we have been in the past before we had COVID and we had to go totally online. But thank you all for coming. Thank you for participating, and let everybody know that this is happening. Okay?
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care now.
Bye.